Welcome everybody back to The Pipeline Guy. I am Anguiano. I am the Pipeline Guy, and today I want to welcome you guys to this video where I'm going to be talking about my workflow for creating Qt UIs for the different applications that I write and how I connect this to 3D Studio Max and basically how I work with Qt and Qt Designer. This is going to be a very basic video tutorial, but before we get started with that, I want to thank you guys for helping me reach 100 subs. I know that that's a relatively small number, but it was a big deal to me because YouTube requires 100 subs for them to actually give me like the proper YouTube URL. So because of you guys, as of today, you can actually find the channel by going to YouTube, see The Pipeline Guy. So this particular video is going to be basically broken in two parts. Most of the videos that I create, I always try to write everything that I do as a standalone application, because then I feel like you're learning Python and Qt outside of your DCC. So hopefully a lot of these skills will basically transfer to whatever DCC you happen to be working on, or maybe you'll just want to eventually write some standalone tools that are not really reliant on DCCs. The first thing we'll have to do is in some of the previous tutorials, I showed you guys how to get Eclipse and PyDev and all of that installed, and I'll also show you guys how to use a virtual environment or how to set one up. So today we're going to be using that virtual environment to create a very simple test application. But in order to write this test application, which is going to be in standalone, we're going to have to install PySide 2. So that's one of the first things that we're going to do, is that we're going to deploy PySide 2 to our Python 3 interpreter, so we can actually write kind of a standalone application that then we'll be able to attach to Max and run inside of Max. The second thing that we're going to do is that we're going to be installing a very useful library called Qt.py. This application basically applied a standard that allowed you to just import Qt elements from it, and you would just write your code as if it was all Qt5 compatible, and it would work on any application. It would automatically detect what version of Qt you had, and then it knew what elements to pull. It also supports automatically different bindings. So this is something that's very important, because sometimes in standalone applications you might choose to use something like PyQt5 instead of PySide 2, which is a different binding for the Qt elements made by a different company. So if you don't want to worry about all of these things and you just want your Qt code to work in any binding and any version, then this library is for you. So getting back to our list, I'm basically going to show you guys how I deploy PySide 2 to standalone applications. We're going to add Qt.py library to our standalone. We're going to do some basic designer concepts. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but obviously we want to create a UI file in Designer, because that's what we're going to be loading into our standalone application. And then we're going to be tying all of this in the end back to Max. So hopefully you guys will find this useful, and you'll start writing and using Qt Designer to make like absolutely amazing UIs. Alright guys, so let's go ahead and get started. So I already have Eclipse running, and I've sort of cleaned up my project, the virtual environment that I set up, just so that you guys can kind of see what files I'm creating and what I'm doing here. The other thing too is that obviously I already have a virtual environment set up for all of this. So if you're watching this video and you're thinking to yourself, hey, how did he set up Eclipse? How did he set up this virtual environment? Please make sure to check out the first video that I made, which was the ultimate PyDev Eclipse tutorial. I'm gonna put the link to it somewhere in this area, somewhere there. So yeah, if you get a chance, check that out. This will get you to this point, and then you'll be able to follow along if you're kind of lost. Actually, I'm gonna navigate to my project directory from scratch so that we can kind of together activate, browse to our project virtual environment, activate it, and then actually start being able to install some components here. So I'm opening a brand new DOS window, and then just navigating over to my project. The next thing that I have to do, this is super important, you guys, make sure that you're activating your virtual environment. So for that, under scripts inside of your project, there's going to be a batch file called activate. So you want to go ahead and run that, and you'll notice that right off the bat you'll get this base project parentheses. That means that virtual environment is active on your machine, and now when you install things through pip, it will actually put them there, and your project will be automatically able to find them. So we're gonna do a couple of we're gonna do two things. We're gonna pip install PySide 2, and then after that we're going to install the Qt.py component. Okay, so we got it back. So Qt.py. All right, very cool. So at this point, we're basically ready to start doing some development in Eclipse using Qt.py and PySide. So we're gonna test this real quickly. We're gonna go here and we're gonna create a little module for application. So I'm gonna call it test designer app, and that will create a module for me. Notice that it already has an init file, which means that I can actually start working here. And the reason why I'm creating an actual module in here and not just creating like a Python file is because this particular application is going to have a UI file attached to it, so it kind of makes sense to put it in a package module so that I have an init there, but then I can also drop the UI in that location, and then it's just kind of like a little bit better organized because the init file that belongs to the application and the UI will be in the same folder, and that kind of allows me to keep things grouped by application a little bit easier. So we're gonna do a couple of things here, and the first thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna set up we're actually gonna start importing Qt, but notice that instead of importing it from like PySide 2 as we usually would, we're actually gonna import from the Qt library. But our import's basically gonna look the same as they always do. We're gonna say from Qt import Qt widget. So then we're gonna write just a quick method to test that everything worked. And this is just kind of a temporary thing. Once we know that this is working, this will be actually replaced by our application. There's a few things that we have to do in standalone applications that we don't need to do in a DCC application. So the way that Qt works is that when you create a widget or something like that, or a dialog that you want to pop, or even a full application, you need to create what's called a queue application. And a queue application is basically like the event loop that like listens to all these different UIs, makes sure that the UIs are open, and then as events happen, it makes sure that those events are kind of executed in the order in which they're registered. So this might sound really esoteric, but just understand that when you're writing a tool for a DCC application, most of the DCC applications will create this queue application in the background for you, so you'll never have to create it, right? But when writing standalone applications, like Python doesn't know that, so you will need to create your own queue application. But creating a queue application is very easy. We're gonna say Qt widgets queue application, and then this takes one input, and it's basically like a list of arguments. All right, cool. So this is basically our application. So the next thing that we will do is we will say test Qt, and then as I mentioned before, the queue application is actually an event loop, and so what this means is that like it actually needs to like execute and stay open, and eventually something will close it. So even though we've created our application, we are not actually executing it yet, and letting it start that event loop that's just basically listening to Python commands. So to do that, it's very simple. We just do app except, and then we just open and close. At minimum, this is what you're gonna need right here to basically create your actual application, so that your GUI will not just like open up and then close down, because nothing's keeping the GUI open. And then this last line is what executes that actual application to make sure that it's just listening to any events, and it knows to kill itself once all of the open queue applications have closed. So our test right now is going to be very simple. We're just going to make a very simple message box. I believe message box is like this. I think we spelled some stuff here. Qt has no message box. And of course, sorry guys, this always happens. I always sort of brain fart in the middle of these things, but it's actually Q message box. Sorry, I should know this, but you know, sometimes even the Python guy forgets a few things. All right, very cool. So that's it. So this is pretty cool, right? We're just basically very quickly we're able to install PySide 2. We were able to get our qt.py library set up, and we just wrote like just a small method that allows us to actually execute a Qt message works in Python. So we basically have a standalone application now. So I personally think that that's pretty cool. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually open up Designer and start creating some content in Designer. So depending on what you've installed, like if you installed PySide 2, then you might actually have Qt Designer installed on your machine already. If you're working with something like PyQt 5 on standalone, then you need to, I believe, pip install this Qt Tools application. But before we get into all of that, let's actually, since we're working with PySide 2 pretty much all around, let's take a look at what's inside of PySide 2. So I'm gonna go into my base project, which is my virtual environment, and I'm going to go into the lib folder, side packages, and in here is basically all all of the things that we've installed. So somewhere in here we should have our PySide2 directory. PySide2, here we go. So this is all the code that makes up PySide2. And look, right off the bat, we have a designer.exe in there. So literally we can execute this guy and voila, look at that. It opened Designer for us. This is pretty great. And we're going to say new form. I don't want this. This is probably honestly some leftover stuff from like an old, like probably another example that I did or something. But yeah, anyways, we have Qt Designer. So that was pretty simple. A lot of people don't use Qt Designer because they don't know that it's actually already installed on their machine. There's nothing extra that you have to do, especially with PySide2. It's just in there. So the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to say pin to taskbar so that like anytime that I close this guy, I just want to be able to like click down here and open up a new instance of Designer so I can immediately get to work. So one of the cool things about Designer is that there's actually, the wizard is pretty easy. There's 3 major components that you can create. You can create a dialog, you can create a main window, and you can create a widget. The difference between these 3 is that a dialog has a built-in .exec method, which basically allows you to open up your dialogs in model mode, meaning that they will kind of freeze the application that launches them until you close them. This is very similar to like modal rollouts in MacScript. So that's the exec, right? So dialogs have that built in. Now you can create main windows and widgets that are modal, but you kind of have to implement that functionality yourself. Now widgets, in the other hand, widgets are neither dialogs nor main windows. They're actually just kind of components that they can be executed as such. But really the idea of using the widget is that you know that you're creating something that you want to be able to embed into other things. So like you want it to be reusable. You want to be able to create a widget that you can add to any dialogue or any main window. And main windows, the big difference between a main window and a dialogue, in my opinion, is that this is supposed to be kind of like a standalone window. Yes, it can attach to Macs. Yes, it can attach to Maya or any DCC app, but it has other functions like you can dock widgets into it. You can have menu bars, you can have toolbars, and you can have like all these other components that are kind of like more specific to what you would usually think of like as a main application window. So for just this particular example, we're gonna use a main window, and as you can tell here, I can make like menus if I wanted to. So I could create like a file menu. I could say, you know, if I wanted to put a save command here, I could put a save command there. If I wanted to put like an open command, I can add separators, and I could add unlimited number of actions here. I can also turn these into submenus. So for example, I could say submenu, like maybe you want to do like recent files or something like that. File 1, right? So these are kind of like submenus that you can create, and you can get crazy. If you want to add more menus, you can add them here. The other thing that's really amazing about doing your UIs in Designer, especially if you come from Macs, is that most of us, if you're smart, you've kind of gotten away and given up on the rollout creator, mostly because that workflow never made sense. You would create your interfaces in the rollout creator. They never knew how to resize one. So if you needed to do resize code so that your UI would be resizable, you needed to implement all of that yourself. And also it kind of expected you to save those rollouts as MacScript and then put a bunch of MacScripts in there. But then when you would open these MacScripts back in the rollout creator and add elements, it would wipe your event callbacks. Like all the code that you did would constantly get removed, which made the whole thing like just super messy, right? So the good news to you guys is that Qt Designer is what we all wanted the rollout creator to be, but it actually doesn't suck. One of the really cool things is that it handles resizing on its own. Like you will never have to write any kind of resizing code for this, and that already saves you a huge amount of time. The other thing is that we can actually save all of these interfaces that we create as a .ui file, and then we'll be able to import that .ui file into Python and then just connect the buttons, and that makes this entire process of updating and editing and adding features to UIs like incredibly easy. And it's truly, in my opinion, a very life-changing workflow. So let's look a little bit into some of the stuff that we can do. So the thing to understand with Qt Designer is that in order to have things space, you're going to be using these layout components here, and the most common ones you're going to use are these vertical and horizontal layouts. This is basically everything that you'll ever want. So for example, like let's say that we wanted a text text box that we can write into, and then we want a button that will basically create a message for anything that we put in the text box. So it's going to be very simple. At first, we don't even have to create a layout. We're just going to drag the widgets that we want into our window. Let's use a plain text edit, and then we're going to create a button. Here we go. We're gonna do a push button, and this is gonna be the main button that sort of pushes that generates the action that creates the message box that prints the content of our text box. That was not confusing at all, I know. So anyway, so right now, just by dropping the widgets, we don't get any type of, it's all kind of just set based on where we move it to, right? But this is not the way we want to work. We want to give our window the minimum information that it needs to do resizing and do all of the fun stuff that Window Designer can do. So I'm gonna actually click on the window here. I'm gonna go to layout, and I'm going to say that I want layout vertical. Cool. That's it. So and now notice that like it's basically grabbed all of our widgets, it's made them vertical, and now when I resize, I get like pretty much awesome resizing for free. As I said, if I wanted to add other widgets, so for example, like let's say that I wanted to add maybe some checkboxes that are horizontal, then I could actually drag over a horizontal layout, and I'm gonna click here on my layout, and then I could actually start dragging checkboxes to it. And sometimes it can be kind of hard to drop them here in the interface itself. So know that you can also do it over here in the object inspector. And boom, there we go. So I can actually drag some cool checkboxes here. So as I said, these layouts are really cool, and you can combine them, you can put them inside of other layouts, so they can really be cascading, and they pretty much allow you to create any type of layout that you want, and then you'll be able to actually, as I said, like all of the resizing will be for free. The other thing that maybe I'll point out is this idea of spacers. So for example, let's say that right now when I resize this guy, this checkbox kind of spread, let's say that I wanted to push them all to one side, then I can use a horizontal spacer and actually have that spacer kind of make sure that these guys are always pushed to one side, and now they all stay there, but my text box still resizes. So here in Designer, we've basically created a kind of complex interface, at least complex for MacScript, in just a couple of minutes, and now we can actually bring this interface into our application. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna save this application as a .ui file, testdesigner.ui. We're basically done with Designer, so we're going to minimize that. Here, we're gonna actually load this UI file in here, and we're going to show it, and it's going to be phenomenal. So, but before we do that, there's a couple of things we're gonna do. One, we need to tell Python where to find this UI file. For that, we're gonna need the OS module. So we're gonna do import OS, and let's actually break this into components, because I feel like I always do it in one line just because I know what's going on, but you guys might not necessarily know all the different components that are going into this. So the first thing we want to do is we want to find like where does the script that I'm currently working in live? Where does this live? So this is very easy. We just do OS path, their name, and all of these files always have like a predefined variable called file, and that's literally like the name of the file that is currently being worked on. So by doing this, I can actually get the path to Test Designer app folder, and that's it. It's pretty simple. So then to find the UI file, I can basically do a OS path join, and I can tell it join the root, which I just figured out, and let's add testdesigner.ui, and I misspelled all of this. So the next thing that we're going to do is this part gets a little tricky, and that's because the best way, in my opinion, to load that UI file into Python is to use a method called load UI type. Here's the problem, and here's where things get a little confusing. This module is only exposed to Python on one of the bindings, and that's PyQt or PyQt5. But we're not working in either PyQt5, we're working in PySide 2. But there's no need to fear. We can actually create our own module that uses this function, and it will just become something that is used in our library all the time. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start this library, and we're maybe gonna call it like Qt helpers, and then inside of here we're going to create a file called UIC. So in order to save you guys some time, I've already kind of put this guy together, and I've went ahead and I put it on my GitHub page. Qt load UI. So this is basically what you guys want to find. You guys want to go to my GitHub page, Mango pipeline, and find the Qt py load UI type. And right here, you'll see the Python file that basically has all the source code that we're going to need. So the easiest way for you guys to get this is actually to download the zip file. We're gonna temporarily just drag this file over to our project. We're gonna copy this guy and we're gonna copy it over to our UIC file. So that's very good. So I basically just grabbed the code of the GitHub page and I put it into my helper packages, and now I can actually start using it in my application. So let's go ahead and bring that method in. So we're gonna say from Qt helpers UIC import load UI type, and that's it. We're gonna actually run this guys, load UI type, and then we're gonna give it our UI. And here's the fun part is we're gonna now, our class, which is gonna be our application, let's just call it my app for now, is just gonna inherit from this guys. And then just like before, we're gonna set up some code to actually be able to run the application on standalone so that we can actually sort of test our things before we even get into Max. All right, there we go. So check this out. So we actually have some sort of dialogue that's open up, but it has no content, right? So there's a few things that we have to do to actually get our UI content to work, but it's all very easy. So in order to do this, we're gonna add a boilerplate init. That's pretty much it. Like, if we execute this, boom, now we get our entire application ready to go. Like, that's it. We've loaded our UI file. This is something that now it's a real application. We can actually code with this now. Obviously, right now, when we execute our interface, like nothing happens, right? Like, we're gonna execute our interface. But yeah, I mean, I can type on it, I can check things, but like, it's not actually running any code. It's kind of like dead. So let's add some life to it. Let's make it so that when I press this button, I can actually create a message box with the content of what's in the text box. So in order to actually add this type of functionality, we're basically going to be using the event signals in Qt. And this is very similar to MaxScript. Like whenever we say whenever we write a rollout, we might add a button, but then we'll put a clause on there that says on button clicked. It's very similar to that, but instead of sort of having a context where we just put sort of like brute force code, we're gonna create a method that, so let's say on print button click or something like that, right? And then we can actually connect this to the signal that's emitted when the user presses the button. So most of my UIs, I will always have a method called connect signals, where I basically list all of the items that are gonna have some sort of event and I connect them to the actual event. But in order for this to actually work, the init method needs to actually execute this connect signals method. So now I can go back to designer. I'm gonna select the object here, and then under object name, you can actually see what that object is called. So it's just called push button. That's easy enough to remember. So I can access it in here through self now because I ran the setup UI. So now all of these things are available as properties in my class. So then I can use the clicked signal and I can connect that signal to one of my methods. So self on print click, make sure that this is not executing inside, like don't leave the brackets that it wants to create. And as soon as we do that, we should now have something that is actually connected, that is alive. So let's just do a print statement here. So if I execute this code now and I click this, look at that. We have, hey, I'm alive. Like our button's actually executing some code now, right? So then this is basically becomes like my event callback in a MaxScript rollout. And what I like about this is that I can go into my UI file and add new buttons at any time, and it doesn't break my signal connections because they're all separate. So now we get like a lot of new features where we can actually use all of the cool resizing and drag and drop features. What you see is what you get of designer, but we also have like a nice decoupling of the business logic and the UI logic so that we can continue to use designer to change these things and not necessarily like have to worry about managing a bunch of code that is mixed. So this is something that I really enjoy. I know a lot of people really enjoy turning UI files into Python code. Please don't do that. Like, it's not necessary. It's an extra step. Like, it doesn't really buy you anything. Like, just basically don't overcomplicate your life. Like, it doesn't make sense. As programmers, we overcomplicate our lives so much. Like, don't do it. Use designer. Use this beautiful load UI type method to very easily bring any dialogue, any widget, any main app straight into your Python code. Anyways, that's my rant for today. So let's go ahead and actually do the rest of the code. So obviously we want to be able to, in our callback, pull the text from this widget here. We're gonna say self, right? Plain text edit, and then we're gonna say, I believe the method is plain text. Actually, to plain text, not plain text. Q message box about on the message box. The first thing that we want to make sure is this time we're going to give it a parent self because it's parented to the UI that we're working on right now, and then we're going to give it a title, so something like my app messages, and then we're actually going to then give it the message that's to be displayed. So in this case it's just going to be the text that we collected. So let's try that out. Hey, do you work? Push button. Hey, do you work? So there you go, you guys. You've written your very first Qt application completely sinfully as a standalone. Now the next thing that we want to do is we just want to figure out how to run this code inside of 3D Studio Max, but it should be pretty simple. Okay, so now we're inside of Max and we basically just want to bring our application in so we can do some testing. So this should be relatively simple. In the previous video called PyDev Remote Eclipse Debugging or something like that, I basically show you guys my workflow for connecting Eclipse to 3D Studio Max and how then I use that connection to do remote debugging. If you guys haven't seen that video, please check it out. I'll put a link to it somewhere there, maybe. Please check that out, and this will give you some idea as to how I connect all of these different things together. But the big thing that we're trying to do now is basically, this is a vanilla Max, so it has no idea about my project. So the first thing that I need to do is I actually need to tell it where my project is so that we can import our application from there. Very cool. So now that we have this, I can actually run my first import. So that's going to be import test designer app. So let's execute this. Okay, cool. So when we first execute this, notice that we do get an error. We get import error, no module named Qt. So as I said, we actually need to get qt.py library in 3D Studio Max. So let's go ahead and get that going. So we're going to open up a DOS window. We're going to actually navigate really quickly to our Max 2020 directory. So we're going to go to Python, then go to scripts, and then we're going to say pip install qt.py, and this should add qt.py to 3D Studio Max. Successfully installed qtpy123. Awesome. So at this point, let's try to execute this now, and look at that, no error. But our application's not opening yet. And the reason why our application is not opening yet is because we haven't actually executed our application. So let's actually do UI equals td app my app, right? And then I'm just gonna execute it and say UI show. And in this particular video, I'm not gonna worry too much about parenting it to the Max interface, because I think that we've done that before. If we haven't done that before, let me know in the comments and I'll show you how to do it. It's super simple. But let's go ahead and get this going, and look at that. Automatically, we're now able to get our Qt application into Max. By the way, all of our code so far, I believe, is completely agnostic. Like, this is an application that technically could work in any application. So I personally think that that's really cool. And we can now test it. So say, hey, I'm inside Max. And then we're gonna say push button, and look at that, it works. It says, hey, I'm inside Max. So I think that, you know, this is like 12 lines of code so far. Well, 12 lines of code in Max, but let's look at, let's be a little bit more honest with ourselves. I'm trying to practice honesty with you guys, and let's figure out how many lines of code it took to sort of get this going. So if we don't include white spaces, we're looking at 1, 2, 3. This could technically be 1, but you know, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. 16 lines of code, guys. It's our entire UI if we don't count white spaces. And yeah, I'm not counting the code on here because this is technically executing our UI, but it's not our UI. So 16 lines of code, like 16 lines of code, and that's even including some lines of code that actually are business logic. So technically our interface is a lot less than that. Technically our interface is just from here to here, right? So that's all of our UI code for this particular application is like really small. I mean, this is almost like 10 lines of code. So in my opinion, this is the best way of creating UI files, connecting them to your Python application, and getting these applications to run both as standalone and to also work inside of 3D Studio Max. So please let me know, you guys, if you guys like this video. Is there anything else you guys like me to cover? Was this useful to you? If so, leave me a comment, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel, you guys. We can't do this without you. We just hit 100 subs thanks to you guys. So I mean, I would like to dream and think that someday I can be one of those cool guys with 1,000 subs. And so if we hit 1,000 subs, what kind of video would you like to see? Maybe we could do like a really cool, I know somebody had asked me about model views, so maybe we could like do the most epic model view tutorial, 1,000 subs reveal. I don't know, you guys know how this works. Anyways, I really enjoyed making this video for you guys. Thanks again for helping me hit 100 subs, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.